My daughter cut me off after the divorce with her mom. She never picked up my calls nor returned my messages. 10 years later, she shows up. I want my inheritance. Give me everything or forget about my existence forever. What happened next will shock you. I will tell you everything. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Dennis Jameson from London. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. I remember the first time she ignored my call. It was a Tuesday, a week after the divorce papers were finalized. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, her name still glowing in the dark like an unanswered prayer. At the time, I told myself she was just angry, caught in the storm of separation, doing what teenagers do, retreating into silence to make sense of adult mistakes. I left a message, said I loved her, told her I missed her. Then I did the same the next day, and the day after that. Weeks blurred into months, months into years, until the ringtone I once knew by heart felt foreign in my ears. Still, I called. Birthdays, holidays, random Tuesdays. I reached out not because I thought she'd answer, but because the act itself kept me tethered to the hope that one day, she'd remember I was her father. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sharp, almost surgical. Every time she didn't answer, it cut a little deeper into whatever faith I had left in being a father to her. It wasn't just the absence of her voice that haunted me. It was the intentional void she left behind. Like I'd been erased, deliberately and without hesitation. Her mother made sure of that. I know how that woman operates, subtle digs, sideways looks, twisting facts until up is down and wrong feels like justice. I'd seen it happen during our marriage, felt it during the court proceedings, but nothing prepared me for how effective she'd be at turning my daughter against me. The last thing she said in court was, "You'll be lucky if she ever calls you dad again." And she was right. Not because I wasn't a good father, but because bitterness has a longer shelf life than love when you feed it every day. I kept the same number for a decade, not out of laziness, but out of hope. Every year I paid the bill, not because I needed the line, I had a separate one for work, but because that number was the last thread that connected me to her. I didn't date for the first few years after the divorce. My friends said I should move on, start fresh, but I was stuck in a loop of guilt and what-ifs. What if I fought harder? What if I'd left sooner? What if I'd seen how much damage her mother was doing to both of us before it was too late? My nights were filled with silent rewatches of home videos, with the sound turned low and the memory of her laughter ringing louder than anything on screen. That little girl with scraped knees and wild curls, who once called me her hero, was gone, and I wasn't sure if I'd failed her, or if she'd just stopped looking for me. Things didn't begin to shift until year 6. That was the year I met Janelle. She worked at the community center where I volunteered on weekends, part habit, part punishment, trying to feel useful in a world where I no longer had the title dad on my resume. Janelle was kind in the quiet way that doesn't need a spotlight. She never asked why I looked like a man who carried ghosts in his pockets. She just offered warmth without the expectation of explanation. Being with her didn't erase my daughter's absence, but it gave me space to exist outside of that grief. For the first time in years, I laughed without guilt. I cooked for someone other than myself. I slept through the night without imagining a phone call that never came. Janelle didn't replace anyone. She just reminded me I still had parts of me worth saving. 2 years later, we married in a small backyard ceremony, with just a few friends and her daughter, Maya, standing beside us. Maya was 15 when I met her. Guarded, wary. She didn't trust easily, and I didn't blame her. But over time, she let me in, not because I tried to be her father, but because I didn't. I was just there, present, consistent. She once told me, "You're the first man who never walked away from me," and I nearly broke down right there in the kitchen. Her words were a balm and a blade. Because no matter how much I loved this new family, there was still that ache. That empty chair, that missing piece I kept pretending didn't matter anymore. But it did. Even if I had stopped waiting for my daughter, I hadn't fully let her go. That moment came unexpectedly, an evening last fall, while cleaning out the garage. I found a dusty box marked for her. Inside were birthday cards never mailed, a photo album from our last trip to Yosemite, and a letter I wrote the night before the divorce was finalized. I read every page, every line filled with hope and apology, and when I reached the end, I sat there in the fading light and whispered, "I'm done." Not out of anger, not even sorrow, just a quiet release. I put the box in the attic, not because I needed it gone, but because I no longer needed it close. That was the night I stopped calling. I didn't change my number. I just stopped expecting it to ring. 10 years is a long time to hold your breath. It's long enough to raise another child, fall in love again, rediscover yourself piece by piece. I stopped counting the missed birthdays. I stopped asking why. I accepted that sometimes, even blood doesn't bind. What matters is who shows up, who stays, who chooses you even when they don't have to. I didn't think about her anymore, not in the sharp, aching way I once did. She had become a chapter one had read too many times, and I was finally ready to put the book down. But then she showed up. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of Sunday that doesn't ask anything of you, the kind where the house smells like coffee and bacon, where you pad around in slippers with nowhere to be and no one demanding your attention. Maya had just left for college a few weeks earlier, so the quiet had stretched a bit wider than usual, but Janelle and I were adjusting. We were planning to drive up to the lake later that afternoon. Just us, a thermos of soup, and the last warmth of late September sun. I had just finished washing the breakfast dishes when I heard the knock. It was sharp, deliberate, not the kind of knock you hear from a neighbor needing a favor. It was the kind of knock that comes from someone who has rehearsed it, someone determined to be heard, no matter how unwelcome they might be. I dried my hands slowly. Something in my chest tightened. Not fear, not exactly, but a ripple of unease, like my body sensed something my brain hadn't caught up to yet. When I opened the door, the past stepped into my present without asking permission. There she stood, my daughter, 10 years older, and yet still wearing that same guarded expression her mother had worn like armor. She was taller than I remembered, thinner too. Her hair was darker, dyed or natural I couldn't tell, pulled back in a sleek bun that made her look more like a corporate intern than the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms. She looked me dead in the eye and said, without even a hello, "I want my inheritance." No hug, no apology, no trembling reunion or whispered, "I've missed you, Dad." Just that demand, clinical, cold, like a business transaction. It knocked the air right out of me. For a moment, I genuinely didn't believe she was real. I stood there, blinking at her, waiting for some sign that this was a mistake, that she had come for something, anything, other than what was sitting in my bank account. But no. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her mouth didn't soften. She was here for one thing, and she had decided I owed it to her. "Can I come in?" she asked, like she had every right in the world, like she hadn't ghosted me for a decade. I stepped aside, not out of welcome, but because I wanted the privacy of my own living room before this conversation exploded the fragile peace I'd worked so hard to build. She sat on the edge of the couch like she didn't want to touch anything more than necessary. She kept her purse on her lap, clutched like a shield, her foot tapping rapidly against the rug Janelle had picked out just a few months ago. "You look good," I said, and it was the only lie I told that day. Not because she didn't look fine, she did. But because what I really meant was, "You look like a stranger." She didn't respond, just crossed her arms and said, "I know you've got money. Mom said you got remarried, that you're doing better now. So I'm here to get what's mine. And I want it all. Everything." I stared at her, stunned, not by the words themselves, but by the brazenness. There was no shame, no guilt, not even curiosity about who I'd become. It was like I was a vending machine she'd decided to shake down for loose change. I leaned back in the armchair across from her and tried to keep my voice steady. "Why now?" I asked. "After 10 years. Why today?" She rolled her eyes like the question bored her. "Because I need it. I'm not going to beg. You're my father. You owe me. Mom told me you always said you were saving something for me. So here I am. Give it to me or forget I exist forever." That last part, those words, they didn't land the way she thought they would. She said them like a threat, like some grand ultimatum. But what she didn't realize was that I'd already lived through the pain of losing her. I'd already done the grieving. She wasn't offering me anything I hadn't already accepted. Forget I exist. The irony was, I had tried so hard not to. But now, hearing her say it, I realized how easy it actually was. I laughed, not loud, not cruelly. Just a single, breathless chuckle that slipped out like a truth I didn't plan to say aloud. I already forgot about you, I said quietly. You have nothing here. Her face dropped, not in hurt, but in shock. She had expected a fight, maybe even tears. She had come here thinking I'd be the same man who once left voicemails at midnight, choking back tears and begging her to come home. But that man was gone. I buried him a long time ago, right next to the wedding ring and the custody papers. What stood in front of her now was a man who had learned, over time and heartbreak, how to choose his own peace. This house, this family, this life, I built it without you. And I'm not going to let you tear it apart because you think you're entitled to something you abandoned. Her lip curled into that familiar smirk her mother used to wear. When she knew she couldn't win the argument, but wouldn't admit defeat either. So that's it, she snapped. You're just going to slam the door in your daughter's face? I stood up slowly, walked to the front door, and opened it wide. No, I said. You slammed it 10 years ago. I'm just locking it behind you. She hesitated, stood, and for a split second I thought I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Regret, maybe, or just surprise that I wasn't bending. But she walked out without another word, her heels clicking down the front steps like punctuation. I watched her go, my hand still on the doorknob, and I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. I felt relief, like a chapter had ended not with a scream, but with silence. I closed the door, locked it, and turned back to my living room. The sunlight was still pouring through the windows. The world hadn't shifted, though everything inside me had. Janelle stepped out from the hallway where she'd been listening, her eyes wide, her arms crossed. She didn't say anything. She just came and sat beside me, placing her hand over mine. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't lost anything. Not really, because you can't lose someone who already let go of you a long time ago. 2 days passed before the fallout began. It started with a text from my sister, Sheila, who had always lived halfway inside our family's business and halfway in everybody else's. Did your daughter really come to see you after all these years? She told Aunt Denise you kicked her out. I didn't respond at first, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew how fast gossip traveled in our family. It moved like wildfire through dry brush, fast, destructive, and almost impossible to stop once it started. By noon, I'd already received 3 calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, each with a slightly more dramatic version of the story. According to one, I'd cursed my daughter out and thrown her onto the street. Another said I threatened to have her arrested. It was amazing how people who weren't even there seemed so confident about what had happened. By evening, I sat down and typed out a single message, one I sent only to the people who mattered. She came for money, not for me. She gave me an ultimatum, and I declined. That's the truth. Take it or leave it. Some didn't respond. Others did, but carefully, trying to tread both sides of a fence they didn't realize no longer existed. But one reply stuck with me. It came from my cousin Marcus, who had always kept his distance from family drama, but had a sharp eye for calling out nonsense. You did what most people are too scared to do. Say no to someone who left you behind. Don't let them spin it like you're the villain just because you finally found your spine. I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over until the words felt like armor. Because as much as I wanted to be unaffected, I wasn't. Not entirely. The next morning, Janelle sat across from me at the kitchen table, her tea growing cold between her hands. She looked at me like she was waiting for permission to ask the question hanging in the air. I finally gave it to her. You can ask, I said, my voice hoarse from a night of tossing thoughts back and forth in my head like a restless tide. Do you regret it? She asked softly. What you said to her? I didn't answer right away. I wanted to. I wanted to say no, absolutely not. That I'd made my peace and didn't know that girl a damn thing. But the truth was murkier than that. I didn't regret what I said. I regretted that I had to say it. That after 10 years of silence, The first real conversation I had with my daughter was one where I had to protect myself instead of embrace her. No, I said finally. But it still hurts. That evening, I heard a knock again. This time it was slower, less forceful, almost hesitant. I opened the door expecting a neighbor or a package delivery. But there she was again. My daughter. Only this time, she wasn't dressed like she'd come from a courtroom. She was in jeans and a hoodie, her eyes tired, her posture slumped. "I forgot my charger," she said quietly, pointing to the outlet near the couch where I now noticed a small white cord still plugged in. I stepped aside without speaking, and she brushed past me like a shadow. As she bent down to grab the charger, she glanced around the room like she was trying to memorize it, or maybe just judge it. "You live well," she said flatly. "You've got all this, and you couldn't even give me a piece of it?" I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, staring at the back of her head. "That's not why you're here," I said. She didn't turn around. "You're not here for a charger. You're here because you think if you poke me again, I'll give in." She stood up, turned, and for the first time since she returned, I saw something real flicker across her face. Not anger, not manipulation, something closer to desperation. "I'm drowning," she said. "You have no idea how hard it's been. Mom got sick last year. Couldn't work. Bills piled up. Then she passed away in May. I didn't even know where to bury her. We lost the apartment. I've been couch surfing. And every time I looked at my phone, I thought, why should I call him? He didn't want me." Her words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were true, but because they were twisted truths. Half sentences and missing pieces meant to frame me as absent while omitting the years I spent begging to be let back in. "I wanted you every damn day," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I left messages. I sent cards. I never changed my number. You chose not to come back." She shook her head. "Because she told me you didn't want us. That you had a new family and didn't care. That if I ever reached out, you'd make me feel small." I took a breath, fighting the swell of emotion rising in my throat. "And now that she's gone," I said slowly, "you decided to test if that was true." She didn't deny it, just looked away. "You owe me," she whispered after a long pause. "You're my father. Even if we never talk again, you owe me something." I walked past her to the mantel, picked up a picture of Maya and me fishing by the lake last summer. We're both laughing in it, sunburned and muddy and alive. I turned it in my hands before setting it down again. "I owe you the truth," I said. "I owe you honesty. But I don't owe you the life you walked away from. You weren't here for the pain. You weren't here for the rebuilding. You weren't here when I cried on the floor because I thought I failed you. You want to cash in on something you had no part in building." She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand to stop her. "You were my daughter once. That was everything to me. But now? You're just someone who came looking for a payout." She didn't say anything else, just pocketed her charger and walked back to the door. As she opened it, she paused, her back still turned. "If I walk out now," she said quietly, "I'm not coming back." And for the first time, I believed her. But I also knew that I couldn't be held hostage by the fear of losing someone who had already left me once. "Then walk," I said. "But don't pretend it's my fault you're leaving." She stepped out into the fading daylight and didn't look back. I didn't expect her to. The door closed with a soft click that sounded far too gentle for what it signified. I stood there for a moment, hand still on the doorknob, as if part of me expected her to knock again. But silence settled back over the house like an old blanket, familiar, suffocating, and oddly comforting all at once. I didn't move right away. I just leaned against the door, staring into the stillness of the living room. That room had held birthdays, quiet mornings, and hard conversations. It had seen me become a man who survived the death of a relationship and the slow rebirth of something resembling peace. And now, it had just hosted the final act of a play I never auditioned for. One daughter's ultimatum, one father's refusal. I should have felt relief. Instead, I just felt hollow. When Janelle came home that evening, I didn't speak at first. I was sitting out back, on the porch swing, watching the last bit of sun fall behind the line of trees. She stepped outside, holding 2 mugs, handing me mine without a word. It was chamomile, just like always. She knew me too well by now to ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. But she sat beside me, our shoulders brushing, her warmth grounding me when my thoughts threatened to spiral. "She came again," I said after a long pause. Janelle didn't flinch. "I figured," she murmured. "The charger excuse?" I turned to look at her, surprised. She gave a tired smile. "You think she didn't leave it on purpose? People like that, they always want a second entrance." I laughed, short and bitter. "Yeah, well, she made her final exit." Later that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her words kept echoing in my mind. "Then forget me forever." There was a time, hell, a decade, when those words would have gutted me. When I would have fought them, rewritten them, begged for a different ending. But I wasn't that man anymore. I had grown into someone who knew the cost of holding on too long, who had learned that love, when weaponized, becomes a kind of poison. You start believing you're selfish for setting boundaries, cruel for choosing peace. But I wasn't cruel. I was just done bleeding for someone who only showed up to collect the drops. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came with quiet, like the moment after a storm when everything is still and wet and broken, but also clear. The next morning, Maya called from campus. She was worried about midterms, something about a biology lab, and an impossible professor. I listened, offered encouragement, and smiled when she said, "I just needed to hear your voice." That small sentence cracked something in me, something I hadn't realized was still holding on. For years, I defined fatherhood by absence, by what I'd lost. But Maya had never asked for anything more than presence. No inheritance, no repayment for years missed. Just consistency. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen, thinking about the difference between blood and bond. One tied you by birth. The other you built, moment by moment, decision by decision. 3 days later, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The body of the message was only 5 words. "You really don't care, huh?" No name, no context, but I knew who it was from. I didn't respond. I sat with the message, let it sit in my inbox like a ghost refusing to pass on. I could have replied, could have explained myself, defended my choices, tried one last time to offer clarity. But clarity wasn't what she wanted. She wanted control. She wanted me to feel guilty enough to break. And I wouldn't. Not again. I had spent too many years trying to make someone love me who only saw me as a utility. That weekend, I told Janelle I wanted to take a trip. Nothing big. Just the lake, maybe a cabin, somewhere without cell service or guilt. Somewhere I could breathe without thinking of who might show up at my door. We packed light, and by Sunday night, we were nestled in a quiet cottage with creaky floorboards and the smell of pine clinging to everything. The lake was still as glass, reflecting the stars like a mirror to something steadier than memory. I stood at the edge, letting the cold breeze bite at my skin, and I thought about legacy. Not money, not land, but the kind of story you leave behind. I didn't want mine to be one of bitterness. I didn't want my final chapter with my daughter to be one of open wounds. But I also refused to write her back into the story just because she demanded a starring role. On our last night there, Janelle asked me something that caught me off guard. If she came back one day, just to talk, no demands, no ultimatums, what would you do? I stared at the fire for a long time before answering. "I don't know," I said truthfully. "I think I'd listen, but I wouldn't bend." She nodded, like she understood. "That's fair," she said. "That's more than fair." And it was. Because forgiveness didn't mean access. Closure didn't mean return. And healing didn't require a shared ending. It only required peace. The next morning, I deleted the email. When we returned from the lake, everything felt just slightly shifted, like the furniture of my life had been nudged an inch to the left. Nothing dramatic, nothing out of place enough to be jarring, but just different. The house was quiet again, in a way that felt intentional now, not lonely. I unpacked our bags slowly, folding clothes with a care I hadn't bothered with in years. I found myself wiping down counters that didn't need it, adjusting picture frames that hadn't moved, organizing drawers no one opened. It wasn't anxiety. It was a ritual. One that made me feel like I had control, like I was grounding myself after emotional turbulence. Janelle watched me from the kitchen, arms crossed, her lips curled in that small, knowing smile of hers. She didn't say it out loud, but but I could see it in her eyes. You're settling back into yourself. But the outside world didn't allow much settling. By Monday afternoon, my voicemail was full again. Not from work, not from friends, but from extended family members, some of whom I hadn't spoken to since the divorce. One from my aunt. I think you should reconsider. Family's family. Another from an old family friend. She lost her mother, for God's sake. You can't turn your back now. Each message carried the same undertone of moral obligation, the subtle accusation that I was somehow the villain for not throwing open the gates just because she had finally decided to show up. What none of them seemed to understand, what they refused to grasp, was that absence has consequences. You don't get to disappear for a decade and reappear with your hand out, demanding not just money, but access, respect, trust. Those things are earned. They're built over time. They're not awarded retroactively because your biological ties are suddenly convenient. I ignored the calls for 2 days. I needed space to think, to feel the edges of my own convictions, and see if they still held firm under pressure. They did. On the 3rd day, Sheila stopped by unannounced. I opened the door to her standing there with that half-worried, half-judgmental expression she'd perfected over the years. She didn't wait to be invited in. She just walked past me into the living room, dropped her purse on the armrest, and said, "You're really gonna let this be how it ends?" I sighed and shut the door, slower than I needed to. "You're gonna need to be more specific," I said, already exhausted. Sheila sat, crossed her legs, and gave me that look, like she was preparing for a therapy session she hadn't been asked to host. "She's your daughter, and you're not broke. She needs help. You could fix this. You just don't want to." That was the spark. The quiet before had been tolerable, but this was the match on dry leaves. I sat across from her, fists clenched to keep from shouting. "You weren't here," I said, each word deliberate, heavy. "You didn't see what it did to me when she disappeared. You didn't see the nights I sat on that couch, calling and calling, just to hear nothing in return. You didn't see what it took for me to let her go, to stop bleeding myself dry for someone who didn't want me. So don't sit there and tell me what I should want." Sheila blinked, caught off guard by the heat in my voice. For once, she didn't have a ready retort. I leaned forward, quieter now, but no less firm. "This isn't about money. It's about respect. It's about honesty. And if she wants back into my life, she can start by showing me she sees me as more than a wallet." Sheila left not long after, muttering something about family pride and forgiveness, but I barely listened. I was too busy holding onto the clarity that confrontation had gifted me. I wasn't angry. Not really. I was done. That was the part no one seemed to understand. I wasn't caught in the storm anymore. I was standing on dry land, watching everyone else try to drag me back into the rain. But I wouldn't go. I had spent too long getting dry, too long healing. That night, as Janelle and I made dinner together, sautéing vegetables, listening to Maya's voicemail about how she'd aced her lab, I realized something. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits beside you, quietly, and waits for you to notice that nothing is missing. Still, part of me couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. People like my daughter didn't just vanish. There would be another call, another message. She hadn't gotten what she wanted, and something told me she wouldn't let that go easily. I wasn't afraid, but I was prepared. I started gathering paperwork, updating the will, clarifying beneficiaries, documenting everything. It wasn't paranoia. It was protection. I had a family now, one that had been built on trust, not obligation. Janelle, Maya, the life we'd cultivated together, they deserved security. I wouldn't let anyone, not even someone tied to me by blood, jeopardize that. A week later, Maya came home for the weekend. She burst through the door with a bag of laundry, her energy filling every corner of the house like sunlight. We ate together, laughed over stupid college stories, and for a few hours, the past didn't exist. But at one point, while we were washing dishes, she turned to me and asked, "Did she really come back?" I hesitated. "Yeah," I said. "Twice." Maya nodded, drying a plate. "What did she want?" I stared at the soapy water, choosing my words carefully. She wanted something I couldn't give her, something she hadn't earned. Maya didn't press. She just reached over, squeezed my hand once, and said, "I'm glad you didn't." And that was it. No lecture. No guilt. Just understanding. It was the kind of support I'd spent a lifetime craving, and it came from someone who chose to love me, not someone who demanded I prove myself worthy of it. Peace, I've learned, doesn't arrive in fanfare. It doesn't knock or announce itself with applause. It's something quieter than relief, steadier than forgiveness. It shows up after you've burned the last bridge with wet matches, when you finally stopped hoping someone will cross over it to find you. It comes in the silence that doesn't ache anymore, the kind that fills your home after a long day and feels like air returning to your lungs. I found that peace sitting on my front porch one morning with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sun melt the frost off the neighbor's roof. Janelle was still asleep. Maya had gone back to campus, and the world felt, for the first time in what felt like decades, completely still. That morning, I realized that peace comes at a cost. And that cost, for me, was the belief that every wound needed to be healed by the person who made it. I used to think closure meant reconciliation, that the only way to mend something broken was to put the original pieces back together. That was the trap I lived in for years. I waited for her, my daughter, to come back and say the things I needed to hear. I imagined scenarios where she would finally realize what her absence did to me, fall into my arms, cry for lost time, beg for a second chance. But none of that happened. When she came back, she didn't bring an apology. She brought a demand. And when she left again, it wasn't with regret. It was with the arrogance of someone who still believed the world owed her something just for existing. Accepting that she may never change was the price of my peace. I paid it fully that morning, and in that payment, I felt something lift, like a weight I'd grown so used to. I forgot I was carrying it. Not long after, I received a letter. A real one, handwritten, in the kind of cursive only schools from 20 years ago could teach. It had no return address, but I recognized the handwriting. It was her. Inside were 3 pages, front and back. She wrote about her mother's death, about how the illness had come suddenly and then slowly, like a thief that first shows you his face before robbing you blind. She detailed how alone she'd felt, how much pressure she was under, how tired she had been of pretending to be strong. Then, she wrote the line that made me pause. "You never called me after she died. You didn't even check." I stared at those words, not with anger, but with an exhaustion I can't explain. I had spent 10 years calling, 10 years begging for connection, and the one time I stayed silent, it was used as evidence of my indifference. That letter wasn't about reconciliation. It was about shifting the blame, about making me the villain so she wouldn't have to see herself clearly. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because I no longer had the desire to explain myself to someone who didn't want to understand me. I folded the letter back up, placed it in a drawer I rarely opened, and went about my day. I cooked dinner for Janelle, kissed her cheek as she told me about a new coworker who couldn't stop gossiping. I called Maya, congratulated her on a scholarship she'd just earned. I laughed, deep, from the belly kind of laughter, and didn't feel like a hypocrite for doing so. I was living, fully, not in spite of my daughter's absence, but because I had finally accepted it. A month later, we held a small party. Nothing big, just close friends, neighbors, a few coworkers. Maya came home for it, beaming as she introduced us to someone she'd been seeing, a kind-eyed boy named Eli. As we stood in the backyard, string lights glowing overhead, laughter curling through the air, I looked around and realized I didn't feel incomplete anymore. For years, even in good moments, I carried a sense of something missing. But that night, it wasn't there. The void had closed, not because it had been filled, but because I had finally stopped poking at it, stopped measuring every joy against a wound that refused to scab. When Eli handed me a beer and said, "Maya talks about you all the time. She says you're the calm in her chaos," I nearly choked up, because I realized, in that moment, that I hadn't failed at fatherhood. I had just been forced to reroute it. Now, I sleep better. I don't check my phone for messages that never come. I don't replay old voicemails or scroll through outdated photos wondering where I went wrong. I've stopped asking what kind of father I was to her, and started honoring the kind of father I still am, to Maya, to myself, to the life I've rebuilt. That doesn't mean I'm heartless. It doesn't mean I don't wish things had been different. But wishing is not the same as waiting. And I refuse to live another year in limbo, hoping someone who doesn't want to be found will suddenly knock at my door with the right intentions. I've already locked that door. And if she ever comes again, I'll meet her with honesty, but not with access. I'll listen, maybe. I'll offer civility. But I will not open my life up like a bank vault for someone who only shows up in crisis. Because peace, hard-won and dearly kept, is not something I'm willing to gamble again. And that's what people never talk about. The cost of peace. The choices you have to make. The people you have to let go. The parts of yourself you bury so you can grow something new. But when you finally pay that price, when you finally stand in the calm after the storm, it's worth every painful cent. Because you realize the only thing more exhausting than walking away is staying somewhere your soul no longer belongs. If you've ever had to choose your peace over a person you once loved, this story is yours. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away without looking back and stand firm in the life you've built without them. If this story hit home, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real, raw stories about family, boundaries, and the cost of healing. See you soon in the next story.